You begin with a simple assumption that reason, when used correctly, can deliver truth. You trust its structure, its clarity, its promise of certainty. Yet the moment you look closely at this trust, a deeper question appears. You rely on reason to validate your judgments, but you also rely on reason to validate reason itself. Al-Ghazali raises this issue early. He points out that if reason is the tool by which you measure accuracy, you must explain how the tool itself is verified. You cannot justify reason without using it. The very act of defending it already assumes what you are trying to prove. You sense the circularity. The mind uses itself to confirm itself. If every argument depends on reason, who verifies the reason that verifies the argument? Al-Ghazali lived in a world confident in its intellectual abilities. Philosophers relied on logic, theologians relied on doctrine, and mystics relied on inner intuition. Each group believed its method alone could secure certainty. Their systems appeared complete, coherent, and authoritative. But Al-Ghazali noticed something beneath this confidence. Each tradition protected itself through assumptions it never examined. Each one used its preferred method to justify its preferred method. If every discipline claims certainty, what distinguishes certainty from shared assumption? Al-Ghazali reached a breaking point when he realized that none of these systems could justify their own foundations. Sensory knowledge could be mistaken. Rational proofs could validate opposite conclusions. Inherited beliefs were accepted because they were familiar, not because they had been verified. You recognize traces of this crisis in your own thinking. Ideas you once treated as unquestionable now reveal the assumptions that supported them. What you thought was certainty begins to look more like trust in familiar patterns. Al-Ghazali saw that doubt does not weaken truth. It removes what cannot endure clarity. If doubt exposes false certainty, what exposes the assumptions hidden inside doubt? Reason impresses because it feels structured and stable. It offers arguments, premises, and conclusions. But Al-Ghazali noticed a limitation embedded in its design. Reason can analyze only by accepting initial assumptions. Without those assumptions, no argument can begin. Philosophers tried to identify universal starting points, principles they claimed were beyond question. Yet every proposed foundation depended on the very rational framework it aimed to justify. To affirm reason, one must already trust it. To evaluate reason, one must already use it. You begin to understand that reason clarifies relationships but cannot verify its own ground. Its strength lies in explanation, not in ultimate justification. Al-Ghazali was not dismissing reason, he was identifying its boundary. When asked to prove itself, reason falls silent. If reason cannot guarantee its starting point, how can it guarantee its conclusions? When you reason, you assume the judgments come from logic alone. But Al-Ghazali noticed that reasoning is often shaped by the self that performs it. You defend ideas that align with your identity. You resist ideas that threaten it. The sense of I becomes an invisible premise guiding your conclusions. You begin to observe this within yourself. When an argument supports your worldview, it feels persuasive. When it challenges your worldview, it feels flawed. This selective interpretation masquerades as rationality but is actually attachment. Al-Ghazali understood that the self silently controls the boundaries of what feels acceptable to believe. Arguments become reflections of identity rather than discoveries of truth. You see how this distorts understanding. The issue is not the logic itself, but the one who uses it. If the self remains unexamined, its preferences shape every conclusion. If reason is shaped by identity, how can identity claim objectivity? The more Al-Ghazali studied philosophical systems, the more he noticed the same pattern. Each system attempted to escape circularity but eventually returned to its own unproven assumptions. The philosopher seeks an absolute foundation, but every foundation requires prior agreement. The search for an unquestionable principle never ends. You begin to realize why theories that seem flawless still feel incomplete. They depend on assumptions they cannot prove. The brilliance of their structure cannot compensate for the fragility of their foundation. Al-Ghazali concluded that every philosophical argument fails in the same place, at the point where it tries to justify the very tool it relies on. No amount of reasoning can validate reason from outside reason. This recognition does not destroy philosophy, it exposes its limits. If no argument can ground itself, what makes any argument final? At this point, Al-Ghazali made a crucial shift. Instead of asking whether arguments can justify reason, he asked what exists prior to argument. He saw that before any thought appears, awareness is already present. Awareness does not need proving. It is the condition that makes proof possible. You begin to notice this in yourself. Before you form a belief, before you evaluate an idea, before you compare one argument with another, you are aware. This awareness does not rely on evidence. It does not rely on reasoning. It is immediate. Al-Ghazali recognized this as the first certainty, not because it is argued, but because it cannot be denied. Even doubt depends on awareness to be noticed. Awareness does not need logic to justify it. Logic needs awareness to exist. Yet this raises its own question. If awareness is the ground of all knowing, why can it not justify itself through the methods it enables? From this insight, Al-Ghazali constructed what he considered his final proof. The deepest certainty is not reached by argument but by direct recognition. Arguments depend on premises, recognition precedes premises. Arguments aim for conclusion, recognition is already present before thought begins. You begin to sense this difference. Logical certainty requires agreement, coherence, and justification. But inner certainty, the certainty of awareness itself, requires none of these. It is not supported by reasons. It is the condition that makes reasons possible. Al-Ghazali argued that the highest truths cannot be established through deduction because deduction relies on what it cannot verify. Instead, truth is known when the mind becomes clear enough to recognize what has always been self-evident. You see that this recognition cannot be taught through reasoning. It must be realized directly. If the highest certainty requires no proof, why do we seek proof for it? When Al-Ghazali saw that argument could never ground itself, he also saw how much pride had been invested in argument. Philosophers identified themselves with their systems. Scholars defended frameworks not because they were irrefutable, but because their identities were intertwined with them. You begin to see this in yourself. The mind does not merely hold beliefs, it builds itself around them. Letting go of those beliefs feels like letting go of the self. But when the structure of argument collapses, the ego's claim to superiority collapses with it. Al-Ghazali described this collapse not as loss, but as liberation, the removal of intellectual pride. Without the need to defend a system, inquiry becomes honest. Without the need to appear certain, the mind becomes open. You sense the possibility of clarity when pride no longer supports argument. If pride depends on argument, what remains when argument loses authority? Al-Ghazali did not reject reason. He repositioned it. Reason is effective when used within its limits. It can distinguish, analyze, refine, and interpret, but it cannot anchor itself. It is a tool, not a foundation. You begin to see this clearly. When reason no longer tries to justify itself, it becomes sharper. When it no longer claims supremacy, it becomes accurate. Reason functions best when it serves awareness rather than trying to replace it. This shift does not weaken the mind, it clarifies its role. If reason becomes reliable only when its limits are known, can it ever exceed those limits? As the need for argumentative certainty falls away, something quieter appears. You begin to perceive a form of knowing that does not assert itself. It does not stand over anything. It does not try to convince. It simply remains. This recognition carries a clarity that argument cannot produce. Not because it triumphs over doubt, but because it does not require victory. It is self-evident without being self-assertive. Al-Ghazali understood that this form of certainty marks the transition from intellectual effort to intellectual stillness. If knowing needs no claim, what becomes of the one who claims to know? Eventually, the inquiry comes to rest. Not in conclusion, but in recognition. Thought no longer tries to validate itself. Argument no longer tries to dominate. Reason no longer tries to prove what cannot be proven. What remains is awareness, calm, unforced, self-evident. The mind sees that truth is not something it constructs, but something it recognizes when it stops interfering. There is no triumph, no conclusion, no declaration. Just clarity. In this silence, certainty is no longer a possession. It is simply the ground upon which thought appears. If truth appears only when argument ceases, was argument ever the path to it?